We have our final panel addressing accelerating charger deployment, energization, and workforce development. And helping to make this panel possible is IREC. It used to stand for Interstate Renewable Energy Council. Does it still go by that, or just by IREC? Just IREC. And so I would like to introduce Leslie Graham, IREC's Director of Development, to provide brief sponsor remarks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. On behalf of IREC, I'm proud to be supporting this panel on charger deployment and workforce development, as those are two big priorities to reach our national climate goals. If you don't know my organization already, we are an independent nonprofit specializing in distributed energy resources. We have a regulatory team that commonly works at the state PUC level with stakeholders to integrate clean energy to the electric grid. You might be familiar with some of our model rules, our interconnection standards for solar plus storage and energy storage. But those are all great successes, making the mass adoption of clean energy really livable and affordable, equitable across the US. So because we're so involved at the state PUC level, we see a couple big issues standing in the way of our national energy transition. One being the lack of grid transparency for EV grid access when you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction or utility to utility. And then also the process for energization isn't really equipped for the level or scale of deployment that is on the books right now. So I assume that the panelists will be speaking to these points precisely, but I also want to let you know that IREC, recognizing EV charging and V2G and virtual power plants all being part of our arsenal for a clean energy future, we are really kind of ramping up and getting ready to engage in this. So we're looking forward to surprising you with some very smart solutions in the future, and we thank you for all the work you do out in the field.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was fantastic, and as a researcher in my previous life as well, love IREC research. If you haven't read it before, it's fantastic and really informative. So for our final panel, I'd like to welcome to the stage Jackie Piero. She is the head of policy and regulation with Mobility House. And if the rest of the panelists could please join as well for panel 5. Take it away, Jackie.
Hello. We lost Larry for a minute. We're just going to have to get started, and he'll join when he can. But no, we've got the full panel. So, right. So, it's been really interesting to hear everything that we've, everything that's going on around standards. But what the people on this panel are working on is figuring out how to actually get something in the ground. If we can't actually get the chargers, get them in the ground, get them energized, it doesn't matter if we have standards to run them. So I think to set the stage, all of us who've been working with deployment of EVSEs probably noticed a couple years ago that the wait time for switchgear for a site went from 8 weeks to, 52 weeks over the course of maybe 6 or 8 months. And it's continued to extend. Same problem with transformers, but worse. Lines, any number of grid components were actually seeming to be scarcer and scarcer, just as we need to be ramping up as fast as we can. Similarly, I saw an article today that was actually saying we need electricians. We need lots of electricians. We do not have enough electricians for what we are talking about doing. And so this panel is meant to talk about not just what can be done going forward, what are the policies that are being put in place by the federal government to mitigate a lot of these issues, but what are we doing right now to actually figure out how to accelerate our deployment in what is a complicated and constrained environment. So I'm Jackie Piero. I am the head of policy for the Mobility House. And we work with charging energy management. We're specifically focused on load management to avoid grid upgrades where possible when deploying EVs. We have Heidi Sickler from BP Pulse, who is a policy extraordinaire. And I've seen work across the country on legislation and really proactive work when it comes to figuring out how to work with EVs. We have David Schlosberg, who's with Terawatt, who is figuring out creative ways to deploy huge infrastructure for depot-based charging and what's it called? En route charging across the country. We have John Halliwell from EPRI, who is also working on figuring out how to get utilities ready to actually face what may be a tidal wave of EVs in some jurisdictions and what may be a trickle in other jurisdictions. And then we also have Larry, whose last name is escaping me, I apologize.
It says Larry Rillera.
Thank you, Larry Rillera, from the California Energy Commission, to actually talk about some of the initiatives that they have going to help commercialization continue to accelerate, to help the state plan for this acceleration. So we're going to start out with the panelists actually doing a better job of introducing themselves than I did, remembering their own names, and talking a bit about what their companies are doing to address the conditions that I just talked about. So Heidi, you want to kick us off?
Yes, thank you so much, Jackie. It's wonderful to see everybody here today on this beautiful day here in Long Beach. Kudos to Erica, Charan, and the California Energy Commission in particular for hosting today's wonderful event, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. As Jackie mentioned, Heidi Sickler, Senior Director of Policy and Market Development with BP Pulse Fleet, formerly Amply Power. We were acquired by the oil major BP. We are the software arm of BP Pulse, the hardware division of BP, and we are really excited to be working closely with our BP family on scaling EV charging infrastructure, not just here in our home state of California, where Amply Power was founded in 2018 by our president, Vic Shao, formerly of ONG and Green Charge Networks, but across the United States. And so we specialize essentially in shifting load from peak to off-peak to help fleet operators better manage energy costs. And we're seeing that throughout the United States, throughout a range of utility territories, we can reduce energy costs for light, medium, and heavy-duty operators by up to 60 or 70%. I'll say that again, 60 or 70%. Today, I can confidently say that we can increase EV charging capacity by 60% without any grid upgrades. I'll say that one more time. We can increase EV charging capacity up to 60% without grid upgrades. And so that should be, in my opinion, the focus of today's discussion. How can we shield ratepayers from potential risks in utility and electricity bill costs, as we continue to accommodate additional EV load? Adaptive load management, load charging should be one of those tools in the toolbox that our regulators can more precisely begin to incentivize and take a look at and scale up throughout utility territories. So that's us in a nutshell. As you know, we have a partnership with Hertz to electrify EV fleets throughout the United States. We have a partnership with Red Hook Terminals in New York, and our largest transit fleet partner is Anaheim Transportation Network here in Southern California. We're very proud of everything that all of these fleets are doing to decarbonize local communities and their fleets. And we look forward to our continued partnership with the CEC, in particular in the context of the I-710 blueprint for medium and heavy-duty vehicle electrification. So thank you for all that you do, CEC.
Brought it home with 4 minutes to spare. Congratulations. David.
Hello, all. David Schlossberg. I'm with Terawatt Infrastructure. I'm our VP of Energy and Utilities, and happy to be on this panel with some old friends and new friends. And thanks to Charn and Erica and the whole group here for putting this together. Terawatt is excited to be here and be participating in the interoperability testing today, tomorrow, and the next day. For those of you who are not familiar with Terawatt Infrastructure, we are a real estate owner and developer of charging infrastructure exclusively for commercial vehicle fleets. And we work with fleets across the spectrum from light duty to heavy duty. And I emphasized, we're a real estate owner. I've been working in EV charging exclusively since 2016 on the charging manufacturer and software provider side, and didn't really think a lot about the real estate component. We wanted to sell chargers to entities that could use them and connect them to our network and charge EVs, but didn't think a lot about the challenges around where these chargers would go and how easy it would be to do that, and how difficult or easy it would be to get power from the utility. Was just sell a box and connect that box to the internet and operate reliably. But as we're scaling up the deployments generically, but also specifically for fleets, the challenge of where becomes even harder. And so the real estate component for Terawatt became very at its forefront. So our history is actually in 2018, our investing founders started buying property around the country in preparation for this moment, when there would be a desire and a need and a collective will for the electrification of transportation, specifically on the heavy duty side. And there would be demand, but a kind of a lack of places to do it and a lack of infrastructure. And so the founders started buying real estate on along highway corridors and in major industrial areas to prepare for the coming electrification. And in 2021, the Terawatt was created to be a managing entity for that portfolio and to build on that portfolio because of what we were seeing at the federal government with the IIJA and the IRA, as well as the vehicles, especially on the heavy duty side, starting to come to market. That this was not just an idea, but really commercialization was starting to happen. And so it was really the need to start taking that action to start developing and building that infrastructure. On the real estate side, we find that fleets want to do this where they reside. That is the place that's easiest to install charging infrastructure because it's the least disruptive to their operations. But that works fairly well for your first installations, your first vehicles. But as you're trying to scale to go from a couple of electric vehicles to 100% of electrification, typically the place that you inhabit does not work anymore. And it does not work for a variety of reasons. One of them is, in a lot of cases, fleets do not actually own the place that they reside. They are tenants, and so their lease does not necessarily line up very well with the duration or the lifespan of charging infrastructure. And so, to make those investments in grid infrastructure that you have to contribute to and the charging infrastructure, it's very difficult to do sometimes with a landlord that doesn't have the same interests that you have. Sometimes you need to make major modifications to your property, and a landlord will say, yeah, you can do all that, but you have to put it back the way you found it when you're done. That can be quite expensive on the back end. And the design of your site that you leased it for does not necessarily comport with charging infrastructure and the infrastructure you have to put in the ground and oriented for vehicles to come in and use that charging infrastructure. And so we find a lot of value in finding real estate that is convenient for fleets or could be a new home for fleets and building that infrastructure specifically for that use rather than just adding it on to the existing use. And doing that from an ownership perspective is helpful because you're not necessarily just paying rent every month waiting for the, unfortunately, 6, 12, 24 months until that infrastructure can be usable. And so real estate, especially in the places where fleets are electrifying, has embedded value and appreciating value, especially when you look at electrifying it and bringing extra value to that property. So, what do we do besides just buy real estate? I think of our world and our business as 4 actually separate businesses. We buy real estate, we develop real estate, we contract for use by fleets, and then we need to operate it reliably. And in order to the reason why we have to operate it reliably, we cannot simply just outsource all of that reliability to third parties. Not because third parties can't do it well, but if as a landowner, our compact with the customer is rent, right? And if you don't do your job of being reliable, they do not want to pay you rent. When you're paying someone, a fee for the services they provide, and they don't do well, you can get money back from that work not being done well, but not to the same level as the rent that you're getting paid for by a fleet. And so the reliability requirements for fleet infrastructure are paramount, and the expectations are even greater than the very significant expectations we have for the light duty infrastructure and the public infrastructure. And so we see challenges to deploying across many different levels, but I'll say interconnection is a challenge, permitting is a challenge, and supply chain is a challenge. And we work across all of those areas to try to accelerate those timeframes, but we individually and as an industry are not moving fast enough to meet the demands of the moment for electrification, specifically of the fleets, and specifically here in Southern California.
Perfect timing, exactly 7 minutes. Well done. John.
All right, I'm John Halliwell. I'm a part of EPRI's electric transportation team. I think our team's grown to record size. I've seen in the last couple of years, this is a hot topic for utilities for sure. If you're not familiar with EPRI, we're a nonprofit public research institute based out of Palo Alto, California, but we have offices in multiple cities across the U.S. I work out of an office in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we do a lot of work with how things interact with the grid, but we span the whole gamut. So we have people that work on generation, transmission, distribution, and then end use of electricity. So I fall in that end use group where we look at what things plug into the grid. When I think about this topic, one of the challenges that I've learned is, you look at the utility industry. If you're an engineer, you wouldn't build it this way. Like the utility industry grew sort of organically. One city electrified, the next city electrified. They grew, systems merged, so that the structure in the U.S. is having a large number of utilities, over 3,000. I think you can say that probably 200 utilities occupy about 80% of our population. But charging needs to be in places where the population isn't that dense. And so the challenge is you're going to be working with everything from small municipal utilities that may have a very limited staff to multi-state investor-owned utilities that have heavy staffing, that can have whole teams of people that work on electric transportation. Whereas some cities may have a department where it's 15 or 20 employees maintaining the grid in that city. And I'm not sure where they're going to go with this. So we're really looking on the EPRI side of trying to develop tools to help those organizations. The other thing I would say is that it's been interesting to watch the progression. So I joined the electric transportation team in 2008. And at that point in time, a lot of our work was about would vehicles even work if they were electrified. That pretty quickly shifted to what would be grid impacts. But we focused on residential. Like everybody was worried that EVs were going to collapse. Every neighborhood's transformers were going to be burning and our lights would be out. And here we are 12 years later, 14 years later, that hasn't happened. Utilities have planned, transformers have been upgraded, and the system carries on at the residential level. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot more focus started to shift to public charging. And at the same time, we were seeing public charging used to be 1 or 2 50 kilowatt chargers. Now it's 10 350 kilowatt chargers. So that ups the ante at a utility in terms of like how deep does that impact go into the system. So I think you mentioned, if you're electrifying 1 or 2 vehicles, those pilots go really well. And then when you get to maybe it's vehicle 10 or 12, there's that sort of stair step where, okay, it's no longer just upgrading my transformer. Now I'm going to have to get the utility to upgrade the distribution feed to my location so that stair stepping happens. The latest thing that's really been on our radar, certainly for the last 2.5 or 3 years, is fleets. And I don't think we really, if you'd asked me in 2010, would we be electrifying medium and heavy duty, I would think, wow, we're crawling right now, right? We're trying to electrify light duty vehicles. And here we're in a world where, I was at ACT Expo last week, and there's large vehicles are coming to market now. And so there's this challenge of we're going now from maybe 2 or 3 megawatt load to fleets where you're looking at 10 or 20 megawatts. To give you a perspective, substations, that can be a complete substation. It certainly can be a whole section of a substation. It represents a fairly large number of businesses in an area would use a 20 megawatt substation, where now it's one customer. And so that does challenge utilities, that planning process, and how they look at these loads, how they'll learn where they're going to be, how fast will they develop. I was mentioning to the group that data centers is one that, that data center load growth was tremendous over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's been pretty quiet, but it's partly because the time frame for data centers to come online and consume power matches with the planning process utilities have. The trick here is that you can go to a fleet, decide to buy vehicles, and probably have those on site in a few months. And so that timeline is really tight for utility if you're asking for multi-megawatts. So I think that's part of it, is how do we help utilities with that planning process, updating what they do. Keep in mind that utilities you're not the only customer, right? They're thinking about the new subdivision, the new mall, the new business. And so they're always, looking at allocating those resources across all those different consumers of energy. So I'll stop there, and we'll probably dig into it more as we go along here.
Larry, take us home.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Larry Rillera. I am staff with the California Energy Commission. A quick shout out to IREC, sponsorship for the panel today. I bring several hats and experiences to this space and this conversation today, and I kind of want to highlight that, not for any selfish purpose, but I think to dimensionalize a little more the conversation we've had and explore some areas that kind of have not been discussed. But let me start with some of the things that are on my plate right now. Clearly in this space, the TE space, NEVI is there, was part of the team that put that together. I'm working on the May 19th deadline for the CFI. That's there. Another team I'm on is with respect to another DOE opportunity on grid resiliency, microgrids on tribal properties. And there's a few of these really awesome projects that TE has this nooks and crannies in its initial forays into these communities that is sort of the context for the work and the responses that I'll provide today to some of the questions that you might have, and more will go in the panel. In terms of my background, I've been at the Energy Commission for almost 10 years now, and have just enjoyed it. I call it a paid hobby because I get to go into these nooks and crannies. But there's also been some pretty phenomenal responsibilities that have been entrusted to me by our leadership. One of them is our commercial space. The Clean Transportation Program has a $400 million commercial manufacturing portfolio, and so I've been able to lead that and pass that off to staff. Oh man, that used to freak me out when I was a kid. All right, we won't go there. The other one is our workforce training and development. That had very small dollars for investments, but it's the partnerships. It's the levers for the workforce training and development that we've been able to cultivate. But the numbers, the ROI, the trainees, the colleges, the partnerships with the workforce entities and the companies have just been phenomenal over the past 10 years. The third hat, in the primary area, we spend time, and as the context for a lot of the work that we do, especially here in California, and sets the stage, is the work in what I call neighborhoods. Some folks refer to it as equity. But this is this intentionality of doing what we do in communities that can immediately accrue the benefits of these investments. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jackie, and thank you.
Thank you very much. So as we're talking about, if we keep in mind that we're working with a variety of constraints as we're trying to go faster and faster, one of the things we need to do in addition to, increasing our manufacturing, rebuilding the grid, is also looking for flexibility wherever we can find it. And Heidi and David, their companies are looking for different kinds of flexibility. I would say, Heidi is looking for how can we avoid new infrastructure? How can we work with what we've got in this place? If you have a transit agency, they need to use the parking lot they've got. And how can we figure out how to cram those EVs into that grid infrastructure? Whereas David's company has very methodically tried to match up available real estate with available grid capacity. We can find places where there is room that you may not have thought to put an installation, but if we can fit 20 megawatts there, we should go there. This all takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of cooperation with utilities. You can't just sort of go around them in this way. And Heidi, I think you could talk a little bit about the work that BP Pulse did with the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator in actually developing a blueprint around how to electrify the drayage with the Port of Long Beach, Port of LA, and how you're exploring that idea of flexibility and how you can make this work.
Sure, great question, Jackie. Thank you so much. And again, shout out to the CC for funding the I-710 Blueprint Corridor. For those of you who may not be familiar with this blueprint, it was a partnership between the LA Clean Tech Incubator, CHAJ, and Equity Group based here in Southern California, the ports, the Harbor Trucking Association, and then BP Pulse Fleet. We provided the site selection and evaluation process. And essentially what that grant funding allowed us to do was to lay out and identify 14 in-depot charging sites along the I-710 corridor, not necessarily along the Caltrans right away, but off of it in neighborhoods where CHAJ did a lot of outreach with us to identify locations that were suitable for communities most impacted by medium heavy-duty vehicle emissions. As a product of that process, we are now seeing some RFPs emerge for the ports to more precisely implement the blueprint and now bring in potential EVSPs, whether us or others, to compete to provide in-depot charging. One question that has emerged across the United States after another goods movement corridors, and the answer is yes. We have something called the BP Pulse Fleet Appraise, Select, and Design that our engineering team offers, where we go into a site and we determine the available capacity in conjunction with the utility. In this case, it was Southern California Edison. We identify the type of chargers that would be most compatible for that use case, and work with other partners on identifying the precise load, essentially, the load profile, which is what the utilities would really benefit from. They don't just want the total rated maximum capacity of a charging array. They want more precise information to let us know whether or not there's available capacity.
This kind of project sort of brings home one of the main reasons we're doing this. If you go to a public meeting around electrification plans, and public utility commissions hold these around states as they're deciding on new plans, I would see people from areas with heavy industrial activity showing up specifically to ask for electrification, saying we are choking on the fumes of these trucks, of these different vehicles that are coming in and out of the port, in and out of these different industrial areas, and we want you to figure out how to electrify. And so this kind of project to actually say, can we do it? Can we do it fast? And what communities can we help while we're actually figuring out how to electrify? It's important to keep that kind of focus, I think. So it's a very cool project.
Jackie, I wanted to touch on that. Electrification of transportation is generally well received in the energy space as well as in the local jurisdiction space. And so there's a lot of collaboration with utilities. There's also collaboration with municipalities. And I think in those municipalities where this is actually a high profile issue for those communities, not just, any community could have a variety of things that are important politically, but in a lot of places and here near the port or even in the Inland Empire, like trucking and truck emissions is actually a voter issue, right? And so we're finding with these first installations, there is a lot of support, and you actually need that executive level support, because a lot of times the building codes and the use codes we're not really constructed for the things that we're building. The types of things we're building. Yes, if you want to add a couple chargers at your existing facility, that can be as easy as pulling electrical, permits. But if you're trying to build something from the ground up, maybe demolish a site and make it a EV truck charging terminal or truck yard, that has a whole bunch of baggage that comes along with it that is not always able to be put in the specific zoning, that is in a specific location. So in some jurisdictions, it is possible to work with an executive or a champion or a sponsor and figure out a way to make it work in code. But to your point about flexibility, code can be flexible if you have the right person looking at it, and if you have the wrong person looking at it, it's very inflexible, right? And so whether we need, pull from the state, that could be one solution. We've had solutions for streamlining permitting for EV charging, but it was mostly for accessory uses at an existing parking lot, and you're adding EV charging. But we're talking about the types of facilities you're talking about, which are megawatt scale from the ground up EV charging as a primary use. We need potentially from the state level across the states, but also you do need that ground up support, because these are the things that those communities are going to be living with. Those communities that, these are being placed in disadvantaged communities and communities that need assistance with equity. And so they want to make sure that this is a good thing for their community, which they believe it is, but it's going to be done the right way. And so it is a collaboration to make things go quicker, because the long pole could be supply chain, it could be utility, but it also could be rezoning and permitting.
And I don't mind, I'll build off of that. So I know Heidi mentioned load profiles. So if you're a utility planner, you're really concerned about power and energy, mostly power, because that's the capacity of the wires and transformers. And so there's a timeline to do that. I think a challenge is you have fleets out there. And so a utility can look at a fleet and go, well, what would their power profile be? And how will that power profile change over time? Will it grow exponentially in a few years? Will they change the type of deliveries they make or their schedules? So it's a load it's much more unknown for the utility. And so the danger there with the unknown is, okay, you're going to put in 10 1 megawatt chargers. I'm going to put in a 10 megawatt service for that. And I can tell you that's going to cost a lot more than if maybe we could say, well, we know your load diversity, you're only going to use probably 20% of that capacity at any peak time. So we could size that at 2 megawatts. So that's a big difference in that conversation. And so EPRI, part of our EVs to Scale project, we're developing a tool called GridFast. That tool is designed to do two things. One, try to translate fleet operations into load profiles and give a way for fleet operators to provide that data into a database that's secure and has the hooks and agreements so that that data can flow in a way that it's contained in the way the fleet needs it to be, but still gives that data to the utility planners. We're looking at building a tool that helps translate the operational schedules of the fleet into load profiles to help feed into that tool. And that starts to help the utility planner. If you may be doing one project, but there are 5 fleets in that, in that area, in that industrial park. So they're needing to really think about the big picture. What are those 5 fleets going to do in the next 5 years, next 10 years? Because that's the planning intervals we need to think about when you're getting into these power levels. So that the GridFast tool does that. The second part of GridFast is looking at also the capacity. So trying to put utility capacities out there in a database. And so we're working with both utilities and other fleet holders. At this point, we've been doing interviews with both of those groups to try and understand what we could put together in this tool. The next step is to start launching a beta version of the tool. If you're interested in giving input on that, let me know. I'd be happy to pass your contact info on to our team working on that. But that's a tool that we feel like is needed, that there's a lack of data flow from fleets to utilities to help get into that planning process, because they really need to have that on their radar.
I'm interested. So is that tool going to be publicly accessible? Is it going to, it seems like that's pretty sensitive data that's on it.
I think they're still working through how to structure that because, some of the data is I mean, it would reveal what you're doing with your fleet in the future. So, how large is it? How many vehicles? And so, there's sensitivity about the data. And so I think the hardest part is working through how do we get that data in a format from the fleets that we can share to the utility planners in a secure fashion. So this is a platform to help provide that conduit for that data.
You touched on something about the way utilities plan. They assume a certain amount of diversity of usage, that not everything is going to be turned on all at the same time across their entire system. The load management that both our companies work with, it's actually about saying, no, utility, you don't need to count on a coincidence, a happy coincidence that there will be less than the nameplate used at any given time. We've actually simulated the fleet's routes, and we can guarantee that we will never use more than an agreed upon amount so that the utility can make planning decisions based on that. And Heidi, it seemed like that was actually something that you worked on with SoCal Edison about how in that project. Was that right?
Sorry about that. Yes, so adaptive load management, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with that term, it's essentially just describing load shifting from peak to off-peak, and we're responding to grid signals. It's at the core, really at the heart of the CEC's load management standards in the MIDAS database. And what we're seeing currently with some of our fleet customers, as I mentioned earlier, just at 60% in energy cost reductions, and also as a result, just 60% less likelihood that you will have to build out additional grid capacity. So this is key in areas that are currently grid constrained here in Southern California, especially I would say in some of the muni territories where they're not investor owned. So they have to go to their voting body, whether that's a city council, and ask for additional resources to build out the grid. So we're really looking forward to partnering with utilities on ways to scale adaptive load management as a way to prevent additional, ratepayer costs. I also just wanted to follow up on a comment that John made about translating operational profiles into load profiles. I think a third layer of that would be interesting to add to GridFast would be the locational piece. We offer a portable charging solution called InRush, and now with the advent of advanced clean fleets, we're hearing more and more from municipal fleet operators saying we really love this idea of a non-temporary charging solution because we may not have a long-term lease agreement for this specific charging location, which is something David, I know, specializes in. And so that can be problematic for utilities as we know it today, because a lot of their grid distribution planning hinges on knowing where these fleets are going to electrify. So I think just having this discussion ahead of time with utility regulators on how to rethink the way that distribution planning is done independently of location will be challenging. Current law, AB 2700, actually does require this data to be passed on to the utilities from the CEC and CARB, this fleet data, and location is a key component of that. So I think that's something that as an industry we need to start rethinking. How can we plan for distribution build out without knowing specifically where fleets are going to electrify?
Larry, as the analytical agency, the agency that works with acceleration of technologies, I know that you work on the IPER on a regular basis. So I would love for you to explain to the audience what is the IPER and how is it that it actually encompasses really everything that all of us have been talking about to prepare the state to actually be able to move forward with the things that we have so many ambitions for.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. So the IPER, IEPR, stands for Integrated Energy Policy Report. This has been a report that the Energy has put out for the last 20 years. Each year there's a scoping order, and it identifies the priorities in which the Energy Commission will tackle issues. The 2023 scoping order essentially focuses in on accelerating our clean energy future. The purpose of the report is to conduct assessments and analyses of the energy industry, and then to provide recommendations and policies in which to effectuate some of those results and findings. It is a document that's interestingly done in collaboration and transparently with industry, with market, with communities all across the board, and not just Californians. And so there's a global perspective that's included in the views and the recommendations put out through the Integrated Energy Policy Report. One of the great statements in terms of workforce that was made last year, 2021, the IPER is used as a vehicle in which the legislature puts requirements to address certain things. One of them was our SB 100. Some of you may or may not have familiarity with that policy initiative, but that's our renewables goals. But the key term in terms of workforce, as an example of IPER expression, is that our SB 100 goals are going to require record-setting construction. That is just in the clean, renewable space. And then here we are talking about our transportation electrification goals and the workforce that's associated with that. And then just go down the list, whether it's efficiency and all these other energy areas where the workforce is going to be required. But certainly the IPER is a place where we address and look at the analytics. And they become legislative solutions, they become administrative solutions, and they become an engagement tool for the concerned stakeholders, depending on your industry or your market.
Larry, I encourage everybody to have a look at this report. It's always a remarkable document, and it really gives you an overview of all of the different factors that are in play around what it is we're trying to do and how they interact with each other. Larry, with the passage of the IRA, the EJA, and multiple major actions in California over the last year or two, does this report, and I would ask the AB 2127 charging needs assessment, did they have to be done differently? Did they look a lot different given all the changes that are happening in policies that impact them?
Yeah, thank you for that. So for those who may not be familiar, the AB 2127 is our electric vehicle infrastructure assessment. We had, I think the last one was 2021, and working on the release for the current version of that. That not only forecasts and looks at all the elements, technical, market, workforce associated with our EV charging infrastructure, but it will account for the investments as well, as Jackie pointed out. And there are considerable investments. One of the things I was thinking about in terms of what the Energy Commission provides in terms of funding opportunity is just the litany of acronyms for the funding programs. And I thought, let me use this opportunity to do that and see how you're kind of in the know and not know, because these are things that staff is just pumping out and will continue to pump out, not just for the state dollars, but for the federal dollars that Jackie had mentioned. And Chill 1, Reach, Rev, NEVI, CFI, Energize, your head can just spin. And then we're going to version 2s of some of these funding opportunities as well. You need a scorecard. I'm staff, I'm in the know, and just an insider to be able to articulate what each one of these funding opportunities and how it aligns with companies' business strategies and their capacities to go into either competitive or certainly where there's non-competitive opportunities for deployments is quite a task. The other part of this is a transparent and public process. This is not a top-down. This is an engagement deliberatively with the stakeholders, the companies, the developers, the utilities to get that information and have that exchange is really what this is, an exchange of the ideas and solutions so that we can move these markets together.
That's a really good point. If you feel like you don't like the way that things are going, you should be participating. You have a voice. They are always asking for input on these things, and they take input seriously. But I would emphasize, if you want to know more about the field that you are playing on, these reports are out there. They are kept updated every couple of years, and they really are some of the best information sources that I know of, for sure. But, as Larry said, these funding resources can be a little dizzying. And one thing that I hear from potential customers a lot is, what do you mean engaged with your utility? What do you mean do it early? And where do I find out about all these funding sources? So if any of you actually have any good, advice on what those mean, do you call customer service? What do you do to actually engage with your utility? Because I think there are going to be actually a lot of companies out here that will be getting those questions. So if you guys can share your experience and insight, that'd be great.
I think, first of all, just a shout out to all of the utilities that have fleet advisory services. We have great relationships with, just the overall this sort of scope of work that they've put forth. And that includes, as Jackie's mentioned and others, just, reaching out to your utility early, providing the number of vehicles, the location if possible. Something that we are hearing more and more from utilities is that they're struggling to identify fleet operators. But I think that will change now with the ACF, and so forth.
I mean, it's pretty much the first thing we do when we look at a property, and sometimes it's before that property is really come to be a real thing. And when we talk to customers as well, it's a little bit of a mysterious function for them, because the people who are thinking about how to electrify the fleet are not the same people who are doing building management and thinking about, capital projects and have typically done that. So there is a lot of new conversation going on with customers across their own organizations to figure out how to do things. But, working with a third party that all they think about is EV charging every day, the second thing they think about is the utility, typically. So, and it's not a mystery. I mean, the utilities are open for business, right? Whether it's the economic development department, whether it's the EV charging group, whether it's just new service inquiries. But that is such a long lead time process. And then all of the things that come out of that also trigger other long lead times. It has to be done critically early. But I will say, right now, obviously, a lot of the activity is focused in this state, and this state has 3 utilities that have maps that are pretty darn good, right?
What maps?
Sorry, I was referencing GridFast here. So maps that show hosting capacity and ability to host DERs or ability to host EV charging and other types of electrified loads. And other municipalities, other utilities do have them of varying quality. But it matters. I mean, when this starts to spread, as most of these clean energy trends do, they spread from west to east. Those territories that have maps, that have more readily available information, will be where customers go first. They'll also go where the money is, but they will go where they feel confident that they can do things and they can actually wrap their mind around it. So maybe you don't have to make that first call to the utility to just have that first idea of maybe where you want to start. Maybe there's a map that you can go and say, well, I've got these 3 utilities in the southeast, or sorry, these 3 facilities in the southeast. Which one do I want to start with first? Well, the one that has a map that tells me that maybe there's a chance that I could increase my power there is a good place to start. And for developers too, it allows them to commit capital resources, for development, for pre-development, if there's publicly available information. And even better if they know that there are going to be fleets there to use it if you build infrastructure.
John, you mentioned, that there are a few very big utilities who will probably be able to actually get funding, have resources to actually work on as Heidi was talking about, fleet assessment services, where they actually are guiding the customer through what do they need for charging stations, how are they actually going to design their lot, how do they actually need to be retraining their staff and that sort of thing. What about the other 3,000 utilities? Are they actually working on ways to be ready for this, or are they not going to see this as much?
I think if you're a smaller utility, you've got to focus on your core business. You're an energy provider, and you've got to do that well. And so I think that's what, smaller utilities are just going to have to focus on, that planning aspect. I think there's plenty of companies, many in this room, that are looking to be that person that you go to and helps do that sort of detailed planning if that's not available from the utility. I don't think I can't see a world where even all of the smallest municipals or co-ops out there in rural areas are going to have the resources to have, big teams to support this. So I think it is a world where private business is going to fill some of those gaps in terms of companies that provide planning and, particularly on sort of the customer side of the meter, like how the fleet behaves and how big a charger do you need and how many do you need. That I don't see that being, a function of a lot of particularly smaller utilities, that they'll focus on that energy provision, like what do I need to do on my distribution system to serve you as a customer. And again, I'll emphasize, I think the experience is going to be very different. If you're going to a large IOU, you probably will get, you'll get access to a larger team and more resources. And that, EPRI at least is trying in some ways to level that a little bit. We thought about, like, it'd be great to have national maps of capacity. I don't, that's probably not going to happen in the near term, but it's something that we're just trying to work toward. And the GridFest project is going to last for several years. Part of that will be including contacts from utilities, so trying to get that information out there so who in a utility do you contact. That's not always clear, particularly in a large utility. Who should you reach out to? But yeah, communicating early and trying to get in their timeline, get it on their table that you're looking. One of the challenges was mentioned that like the fleet may not own the property. And for utilities, there's always the thought in the back of their mind that they just, it's not the field of dreams, we'll build it and they will come, right? The utilities generally are regulatory bound to make sure that they'll, over time, gain revenue from that asset to cover its cost. And so there's a concern where, like, the fleet lease period doesn't match the timeline needed to amortize that equipment. And those can be challenges in that process.
Larry, in the analyses that the CEC does, do you actually include potential workforce needs, both within the utilities and, IBEW trained electricians and that sort of thing? Is that something that you actually make recommendations about, or is that more downstream?
Yeah, so I tend to look at the workforce in terms of labor and everything associated with projects, construction, installation, commissioning, and it doesn't matter the occupations and the skill sets or the job roles. It could be the workforce at the utilities, could be the workforce with the contractors, and everything associated kind of on that. Then there's this workforce training and development, which is this ongoing and continuous support, training and skilling and upskilling. Some of it was mentioned in an earlier panel with respect to some training for 15, 11, 8, and 2 levels of training that were offered there by one of our presenters. And so both of these dimensions are done in collaboration with labor. They are done with interested community groups. They are done with the workforce entities. They're done with the employers. And so it's looking at this complete dynamic and understanding this part of our clean energy complex, if you will, and drawing some attention to it. Specifically, as an example, our AB 2127 report, EV infrastructure report, in 2021, when we issued our initial report, it was about a page and a half. But it was enough to drive legislation. It was enough to draw attention of folks who wanted to learn more and see if there was some impact to their business or to their enterprise. And then there were also, we've heard this term today, future-proofing. They're future-proofing not just their supply chains, but their human capital as well. And so taking a look at the workforce and bringing that aboard with scale is equally important. We'll see another expression, much more deliberative, in fact, a complete chapter devoted to labor and workforce in our next AB 2127 report.
So we're running short on time here, and I know that there are cocktails waiting. So what I'd like to do is go down the line, and given everything that we've talked about, we have a monumental effort. We're transforming multiple industries, and we are short on grid components, we're short on time, we're short on people, and we're short on grid space. I don't like to do magic wand questions. What would you do if you could wave a magic wand? Because all that does is encourage people to say, this is the biggest problem I don't know how to solve. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to have everybody say, what do you think is the most important action that can be taken in the next year? And what's the most important action that you think should be taken for 10 years from now?
Okay. Wow. So much there. Actually, I have three things. I think in the near term, incentivize load shifting and adaptive load management. Why? It's the low-hanging regulatory fruit. The CC has already acknowledged it in two different ways, load management standards and their recent Redwood solicitation, which we love. So thank you, CC, for your leadership on that. And now it's just up to the utility regulators to find a way to incentivize it. They currently don't require it here in California or anywhere else, but I think that there's, there are good opportunities to do so, and we have a lot of ideas on how to do that. So if any utility regulators out there, please come and see me afterwards. In the long term, over the next 10 years, what we just saw, Energy Division, the CPUC, issue this week was an announcement for a webinar on anticipatory load for medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification, mirroring the efforts that National Grid and others in New York are undertaking so far legislatively. We know Southern California Edison is going to be going, or has already gone this month, to the CPUC to ask for authorization for additional ratepayer dollars to help build out grid capacity to accommodate probably ACF load, maybe around the ports. I don't know exactly where, but it's top of mind for them. We've heard, Edison International President Pizarro talk about this recently in a Bloomberg News interview where he's saying, look, as part of grid resiliency, we do need to start thinking about how to accommodate additional fleet load. So it's great that SEC is being proactive about it. Third thing I'll just mention really quickly, I want to give a shout out again to the CC for their EDGE tool. I think that is an interim solution, and I'm really excited to see how the beta testing for that tool goes. BP Pulse Fleet has a comparable idea in mind.
What's the EDGE tool?
It's essentially an online portal, Jackie, that shows where there is available grid capacity. And Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is trying to integrate more and more of the ICA map data that David mentioned, so that it becomes more of like an interactive tool for site developers to use to select feasible versus infeasible EV charging sites. That's supremely important because it'll cut back both on the manual friction that a lot of utility engineers encounter just because of, they have all of these applications coming in, all these load letters, they can't get through them quickly enough. But what this online tool could potentially do, and we have something similar called an online EVSE project planner that we hope to take to potential funders out there who might be interested, is to, just as a first filter, go to the utility and say, based on these inputs and based on the data that is part of this online publicly facing platform, we've identified these 3 sites for potential energization. And so far in talking to the utilities, they really like the idea, Cali, TC, and so forth. So we're excited about these potential solutions. So thank you.
Great. David, 1 year, 10 years.
Noel, while he's typing away, I'm going to give him credit for a LinkedIn post I saw the other day for him. So I need to go do some research on how the Defense Production Act is actually going to be implemented to help with grid components, because, in development, you're always, how do you knock down the longest pole in the tent? And the longest pole in the tent for all of our work is switchgear and transformers. Maybe an economic downturn, which is bad on the whole, would be good for this, but we all have NEVI and we all have lots of other things that are going to keep, at least on the EV side of the world, those components in high demand. And so to accelerate deployment in the next year, we won't have deployment in the next year for anything you want to do today because it'll take you that long to get the equipment. And then on the 10-year, I think it'll be less than 10 years, but it's going to be megawatt charging, but done efficiently and sensibly. That's obviously a focus for heavy-duty vehicles. It's not going to be relevant for light-duty vehicles so much, but that will be transformative for deployment of vehicles as a whole.
I feel like everyone here just looked up when you said megawatt charging. What? We need to make more grid components and we need to use less grid components. We're going to need to do both if we actually want to roll out successfully. John.
So I think in 1 year, I'll focus on what EPRI would probably be doing in like the 1 year time frame. I think we're really focused on helping utilities develop tools. I think that getting their planning processes where they're ready to work on these really high power loads as quickly as possible, that's a real challenge. And it, like I say, it falls in with sort of a long history of how they do planning that maybe needs to be adjusted now for this, like it's different. So I think that's a challenge. 10 years is tough because when you think about the electric grid, what will it be like in 10 years? That right now it's sort of a command system where you generate exactly what you need to consume. And we've been talking for a long time about going to a much more diverse system where there's distributed generation that's managed, a much more complex system. And I don't know which way we're going to go. Like there are cost benefits in doing that really smart approach that involves communications and a lot of control and that sort of thing. Or we just go put out bigger wires and bigger transformers and we just beef the system up to meet the demand. And I think either of those could play out, and I won't speculate which way it'll go, but I think maybe we'll see a little of both. Some of that intelligence to get economy of scale out of the smart way to do things. There are cost savings, but there's also overhead in that communications and risk on reliability when you're relying on communications. So that'll be interesting to see, like that 10 years. I don't, my crystal ball's foggy on where does the grid land in a decade.
Yeah, I used to have a professor who said, anybody who tells you they know what the energy system's going to look like in 10 years is lying. But we got to try. Larry.
So 1 year, 800,000 jobs were estimated from our federal investments, IIJ, BIL, IRA. There was a report that came out a year ago, that indicated 62,000 jobs are going to be needed for our EV infrastructure needs. So clearly, the first year is continue to attract the workforce, develop it for our near-term goals, this 1 year one. 10 years, it'd be an absolute shame if the communities we're talking about, the neighborhoods, don't accrue the environmental and economic benefits of these investments.
I apologize for entirely ignoring the audience and just giving into my own curiosity and asking a bunch of questions. So if you do have questions for this crew, you can mob them out at the reception. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time.